Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you all for this summit on AI for global goods. We are hearing about the many exceptional ways that AI, and especially its modern incarnation, including generative AI, can help humanity. It can help us live better lives. It can accelerate scientific breakthroughs. There are several experts who also believe that AI can raise global productivity. That would be a wonderful thing to have, given that right now we are facing one of the weakest growth projections we have for the medium term for the world economy. So anything that can help raise productivity would be exceptionally valuable. Now, at the same time, several experts are also pointing to the uncertainties around AI and also the risks around AI. Now, to date, there have been many kinds of risks that have been highlighted, including issues on privacy, on ethics, on misinformation, on security-related challenges. Today, I'm going to focus on a different kind of risk. I'm going to take an economic perspective and discuss a risk that I believe is much less talked about. And that is the risk that AI can amplify the next economic downturn. So let me explain. I think we can all agree that there will be another downturn. That much is certain. And if we are in a world where there is widespread adoption of AI, in that world, we see AI can have the ability to deepen and prolong that downturn, which is to convert what would be otherwise an ordinary downturn into a much more deeper economic crisis. And it can do this through disrupting labor markets, financial markets, and supply chains. So this is what I'm going to describe, but I'm not going to leave you just with that. I'm also going to go and discuss some policy actions that, if taken now, can help address and mitigate that risk. So let me jump in. So first, let me start with labor markets. And here, previous waves of automation provide us a helpful warning. Here's what we know. We know that in normal times, when firms and companies are flush with profits, they invest in automation. In this particular case, it would be in modern forms of AI. And even though the value added of workers begins to decline, they hold on to these workers because they have the profits to do so. But then you hit a downturn, and they enter cost-cutting mode. And at that time, that's when you see humans being replaced with automation. So in other words, you don't really see how AI can replace humans in normal times until you've hit a downturn. And there is research that shows that. So in fact, there's some excellent research by Jaimovich and Su that show that close to 90% of automation-related job losses happen in the first year of a recession. And if you take a very recent example of this is what you see on your slide. It is the great financial crisis of 2008-09. What happened then was we saw workers being laid off, and an increase in automation, which then basically delivered one of the most serious forms of jobless recoveries that we have seen following any recession. And the reason we had these jobless recoveries was almost entirely because of a permanent loss of routine jobs that got replaced with automation. So now, if you look at the current juncture that we're in, and the wonderful promise that AI has to offer, we also know that it affects a much broader spectrum of skills, including high-skilled cognitive jobs. So our research, for example, shows that if you look at advanced economies, about 30% of jobs are at high risk of displacement. In emerging markets, that number is 20%, and in low-income countries, that number is 18%. So we have a much broader scale of potential job losses that we could have. And again, the risks of long-term unemployment are quite severe. So this is on the job market. When an event like this happens, this is consequential for all other kinds of economic activity. The financial sector will be seriously impacted if you have a very large number of job losses. But that's only part of the disruption to financial markets that I want to talk about, because there are novel kinds of dynamics that could emerge in a next downturn. Why is that? Because we are seeing a very rapid adoption of AI in the financial industry. Now, to be clear, the financial industry has been using algorithmic trading for a very long time. You see that on the left graph. This is not new. Machine learning has been used. But we are seeing financial companies replace older models with more complex models that have the ability to learn on their own. And some of the inner workings of these models are even complex for an expert to deal with. So we could see a much more client-facing use of AI in the investment industry. And so, for example, the right slide shows you that if you look at projections of robo-advisors controlling assets, that number goes up to around 2.8 trillion by 2028. Now, again, in normal times, this is all good. There are lots of reasons to believe, because AI has the ability to use a vast amount of information to make predictions, you could end up with greater market efficiency, you could end up with greater financial inclusion, and that's wonderful. In fact, if you look at surveys of investors, about 60% of them say that within 3 years, this technology has the ability to increase market efficiency in the financial markets. So that is the promise. Of course, there is also the risk that comes along with this, and that risk is more likely to show up in a downturn. And why is that? This is because these newer models have been shown to perform poorly in the face of novel events, in the face of events that are very different from the kinds of data they have been trained on. And one thing we know is that no two recessions tend to be the same. So if you look ahead and think of a future downturn where you could have novel patterns of outcomes, including forms of job losses that we haven't seen in the past, you could end up with these AI systems performing poorly. You could very well have a scenario where you could see a very quick, simultaneous portfolio allocation of assets to safe assets away from risky assets. And when this happens, and you see prices fall of risky assets, the models will receive the positive signal that they were right, that they will double down on this, and you could have fire sales and herding behavior, which lead to even larger collapses in asset prices. This, of course, would be a scary situation in of its own, but given the black box nature of these applications, it could be a pretty difficult event to control. And lastly, I want to talk about the third source of amplification that can come through supply chains. Here again, because of the more user-friendly nature of this technology, we could see companies using generative AI to make predictions about how much inventories to hold of different kinds of goods, how much to produce. And again, just like for the financial markets, this could be very good in normal times. It can increase efficiency, it can increase productivity. But again, in a future downturn, when you have events like no other, these AI models trained on stale data can generate serious forecast errors and lead to cascading breakdowns in supply chains. And we don't really have to think back too far to recall how costly supply chain breakdown can be. We saw this during the COVID crisis in terms of the high pressure on supply chains, and also what that implied for all of us in terms of higher prices and higher cost of living. So again, in a future downturn, if the process is not properly managed, there is a real risk that you could end up with an ordinary downturn deepening into a prolonged economic and financial crisis. Now, of course, we don't have to take that for given, so I'm going to now move to the second piece of my presentation, where I talk about the kinds of policies that can help. So what policy actions can be taken now to prevent such a crisis? Now, I do so keeping fully well in mind that it is hard to make a prediction of what the next crisis will look like. I also do so keeping in mind that any policies that we recommend to mitigate the risks should not curtail the positive promise that AI has for helping humanity. So with those two pieces in mind, I'm going to talk about three kinds of policies that I believe can help mitigate such a risk from the adoption of AI. The first is to ensure that you have a tax system that does not inefficiently bias in favor of automation. So let me explain what that is. Governments around the world give multiple forms of incentives to companies in terms of what to invest in. And you can make a calculation of what those incentives look like for investments in, say, software and hardware versus other kinds of investments. And we have new research that shows that for several countries, including Germany and the United States, the tax system as a whole tends to favor automation relative to humans. Now, question, is that a problem? It's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you believe that the social return from investing in certain kinds of technologies that ultimately are labor substituting as opposed to labor augmenting, and if you think that is good from society's perspective, then there is a reason why you might want to favor that kind of investment. But I just described to you several of the risks associated with AI, in addition, of course, to its promise, but there are several risks associated with it. And so given that, I think we have to ask ourselves, is the social return high enough to have these kinds of tax structures? Now, I want to be very clear here, because there's a lot of discussion going around on whether there should be a special tax on AI. I am not proposing a special tax on AI. What I am arguing for is for governments to reconsider the corporate tax incentives that they are providing that currently, in some countries, makes AI special. And that has obviously implications for its adoption and for what consequences for the future. So that's one block of recommendation. The second block of recommendation is on helping workers cope with the impact of AI. What does that mean? That means this is something that's familiar, you've heard it before, that greater investments will be needed in education and in skilling so that you can upskill workers to match the outcomes, to match what they can do with AI. And this is particularly necessary in emerging market and developing countries, because as you can see on the left slide, if you look at the fraction of youth that are neither in education, nor in employment, or in training, that fraction is close to 25% in emerging market and middle-income countries, which makes these economies then particularly ill-suited to dealing with the AI transition. We also have new research on the IMF which looks at AI preparedness across countries, and you see the right graph over there, which is you see emerging markets and middle-income and low-income countries are less prepared to deal with the AI transition. How do you address that? You address that by taking on more in terms of investment in digital infrastructure, skilling, training, and so on. Now, this will in and of itself not be enough. There also needs to be a strengthening of social safety nets, because if we are in an environment where there are more job losses, we need stronger social safety nets. Here again, we have forthcoming research that shows that there are ways to strengthen these safety nets, including through more generous provision of unemployment insurance, because when you do that, you give workers a longer time to look for a better match, and then the automation-related wage declines that they typically see is overcome. So this is evidence from previous rounds of automation. So more generally, there is scope for countries to do more in terms of the coverage of unemployment insurance, the scope of it, the portability of it, and also newer forms of what's called wage insurance. Now, the last bit in terms of the third block of policies that I want to speak to is what will help lower the risks coming from financial and supply chain amplification. So when it comes to financial markets, this will mean improving forms of supervision and regulation. To do that right, that will require the regulators themselves to upskill so that they become familiar with the new kind of technology that is being used. At the same time, when it comes to disclosures by financial institutions, I think disclosures that give clarity in terms of how AI is being used, what models are being used, what circuit breakers they have to prevent herding behavior and distressed sales, all of that is going to be extremely helpful. So this is a long list of recommendations. I will also add one more, which is in terms of stress testing. I think all companies, financial institutions, non-financial institutions, should stress test their models to make sure that they can respond well to events like no other and prevent these kinds of herding behavior and distress sales that I talked about. Now, AI is not just, like I said, AI has a lot of promise. This promise also is part of the solution. So there are many ways in which AI can help address these basic three blocks of problems. So how does it do that? AI can help with upskilling, especially in countries where you have scarcity of teachers. It can help in public finance in terms of raising more revenues. Again, we have research that shows that. It can do much better targeting of social assistance. It can help giving an early warning in terms of financial risks. Again, that's something that AI can do. And the more AI developers can focus on improving the robustness of their models to events like no other, that would be hugely valuable in preventing these kinds of risks that I described. So let me be clear here, which is that what I'm suggesting is a significant change from what's being focused on these days in the international space. Most international efforts are focused on how to address issues of privacy, and, ethics, and misinformation, all extremely important and should be done. But I believe there is a real need to have a parallel effort to make sure that we're also AI-proofing the global economy. And this will require, firstly, policymakers to start with having granular, following in a granular sense how AI is being adopted, what it implies for economic outcomes, including employment and productivity and prices and financial stability. The only way you can do this, given the tremendous uncertainty, is to do scenario planning, and that's going to be extremely beneficial. So let me close, and let me first reiterate that what I am describing is a potential risk. I am not making a prediction. But given the hugely disruptive nature of that risk, it's going to be very important for policymakers to invest in all of these questions that I laid out. Because if they don't do so, they could very likely be flying blind in the next recession. So again, this is a risk. We want to mitigate it. At the same time, we absolutely need to recognize the huge positive potential AI has for the world, and I certainly do not want to discount that. So we should be careful on how we implement policies. I mean, just as I would say, AI has the power to change our lives and the global economy, and we have the power to shape that change for the better. Thank you.
A very bracing, I think, assessment about some of the challenges that we face. I'd love to go back to sort of the beginning of your talk, where you were speaking a little bit about sort of some of the challenges that we face around AI, but also the fact that AI could actually help to increase productivity, which will drive the growth that's been eluding so many major economies. Can you just dig into that a little bit, please?
Absolutely. So, as I said, we are projecting a medium-term growth outlook, as in we at the IMF are projecting a medium-term growth outlook. That's one of the weakest in decades. And so any kind of technology that can help boost productivity is very welcome. I would say that we're still in an early stage of assessing what the magnitude of that effect can be. There are a wide range of estimates. You have, at the, I would say, low end, the possibility that AI could raise productivity cumulatively over 10 years by 1% to 2%. That's not that large.
Yep.
But there are also other studies that show that you could have it increase by, say, 10 to 15%. I think it's still early days. The good news is that even the pessimists seem to believe that the effect is positive. So I think we should continue to work in that direction and undertake necessary investments to make sure that countries around the world can benefit from this technology.
You obviously talked about policy recommendations around labour. I think that's something that's on everyone's mind, labour markets. The data you sort of showed suggests that many high-skilled, highly skilled cognitive jobs are going to be under threat. Do you think that AI is more of a challenge to labour markets in developed economies, maybe than those that are maybe developing?
Yeah. So if you look again at labour market exposures based on income classes, so advanced economy versus emerging markets, low-income countries, it's certainly the case that advanced economy workers have the biggest exposure to AI. So that number is 60% for advanced economies, while the world average is about 40%. But within that 60%, you have those who would benefit from AI being used, applied to their jobs, and those who would have, for whom it would be a negative effect. It's about an even split, about 30%. So advanced economies certainly have greater exposure to AI. The risks of job displacement in that sense look higher. But on the other hand, they also have the huge benefits of AI in terms of being able to use AI to raise labor productivity. That is, again, something that they have access to, unlike low-income countries, where even though their exposure is smaller, they're not necessarily able to use AI as much in terms of raising productivity.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but like so many speakers today, obviously lots of opportunity, lots of reasons for optimism, but obviously we have to think about mitigating the risks. Gita, thank you so much for your talk today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.